All right, let's go. Number 10. Micah 5:2. In the spring of 1952, Roland DeVos led a formal excavation team from the Col Biblique et Archéologique Fournaise in Jerusalem into the gorge of Wadi Marabaat, 12 kilometers south of Qumran in the Judean desert. Bedouin tribesmen had been extracting manuscripts from those cave systems since the year before, selling them through Bethlehem antiquities dealers. DeVox's team entered Cave 2 and worked through stratified debris representing centuries of intermittent human occupation. The air was dry, the walls cold. Among the material they recovered was a Hebrew minor prophet scroll designated Mur 88, parchment in poor condition, text still legible. Among the texts it preserved, intact and unambiguous, was Micah 5:2. The prophecy had been composed approximately 730 years before that scroll was copied. What the text says is geographically specific in a way that has no parallel in general prophetic literature. Micah was not predicting that a great ruler would emerge from Judah. He was not pointing to Jerusalem, the administrative and religious capital of the kingdom. He named a specific obscure village, Bethlehem, and immediately qualified which Bethlehem he meant, Bethlehem Ephrathah, the settlement in Judah associated with the clan of Ephrathah. That clarification was not literary decoration. There were two settlements named Bethlehem in the Israelite tribal territory. The second sat in the tribal allotment of Zebulun in Galilee, confirmed in Joshua 19:15. Micah's text specifies Ephrathah to eliminate the ambiguity, not the Galilean Bethlehem, the one in Judah, the smallest, most obscure settlement on the list. By the 8th century BC, Bethlehem Ephrathah held no military significance, no administrative function, no commercial importance. Micah's text acknowledges this directly. It describes the town as too small to be among the clans of Judah. The prophet was not extrapolating from a geographically prominent location. He was making a specific claim about an agricultural village that had produced David 4 generations earlier and then returned to obscurity. What Russell Fuller of the University of San Diego documented in his critical edition of the Minor Prophets Scrolls from Qumran, published in Discoveries in the Judean Desert XV in 1997, was that the Qumran manuscripts of Micah present no variants in chapter 5 that affect the core geographical content, the town name, the clan designation, the qualification distinguishing it from the other Bethlehem, all stable across traditions. The Hebrew phrase the text uses for this ruler's origins, Motzaotav Mikedem, rendered in most translations as from of old or from ancient times, reaches beyond normal royal genealogy. Mikedem appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible in context describing primordial divine activity, not historical ancestry. For the first century sources, this was not a reconstruction after the fact. Matthew 2 records that when Herod asked where the Messiah would be born, the chief priests and scribes cited Micah 5:2 immediately. The alignment was the established reading, preserved and recognized for 7 centuries before the event. What makes the specificity difficult to dismiss is the problem of false negatives. The prophecy requires a specific location, a specific size, and a specific tribal identity. Any single element might be generic expectation. All three together, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, and Judah, explicitly distinguished from the other Bethlehem, narrow the prediction to one coordinate on one map. There is no interpretive space to resolve after the fact. The text named one address. The address did not change. Mur 88 is preserved in the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, cataloged alongside the other cave materials recovered during DeVox's 1952 fieldwork. The text of Micah 5:2 is in it, with its specification of Bethlehem Ephrathah. The village it names still exists. It is still called Bethlehem. It is still in Judah. It is still small. Also, if you enjoy this kind of content, there's a 60-page ebook going deeper into the archaeological evidence that confirms the Bible. Link is in the description. Number 9. Zechariah 9 verse 9 in 1954. Yigael Yadin, the Israeli archaeologist and former military chief of staff. purchased a Greek scroll through an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. The seller was Khalil Iskander Shaheen, known as Kondo, who had been the primary intermediary between the Tammire Bedouin tribesmen extracting manuscripts from the Judean desert cave systems and the scholars and institutions seeking to acquire them. The scroll had been pulled from the canyon systems of Nahal Hever, south of Qumran. It was in fragmentary condition. It was a Greek translation of the 12 minor prophets, produced in approximately the 1st or early 2nd century C, designated 8 Hev Xi-Gr. Emmanuel Tove of Hebrew University, who would later serve as chief editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project. Together with Robert Kraft and Patricia Parsons, published the critical edition and discoveries in the Judean Desert the Eighth in 1990. Among the 12 prophets the scroll preserved was Zechariah, and in chapter 9 verse 9 they found what they expected to find, a text that had been stable for centuries. Zechariah delivered his oracles between approximately 520 and 480 BCE, after the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon. He was writing in a world where warfare was conducted from horseback and chariot. The horse was the military instrument of kings throughout the ancient Near East, in Egyptian war reliefs, in Assyrian palace carvings, in every representation of royal military power the period produced. A king arriving on a warhorse announced conquest. The visual vocabulary was universal. Zechariah 9:9 specifies a different animal. The king it describes comes to Jerusalem mounted not on a horse but on a donkey, specifically a colt, the foal of a donkey. The text further describes this king as righteous, as having salvation, and as lowly. The vocabulary cluster, righteous, victorious yet humble, arriving on a beast of burden rather than a war horse, creates an image that inverts the standard iconography of ancient Near Eastern kingship. This is not a description that arises naturally from the political aspirations of a community rebuilding after exile. It inverts them. The 8 Hev Xi-Gr scroll preserves the Zechariah 9:9 text without variants that affect the description of the animal. The town name, the characterization of the king, the specific animal, all consistent with the Hebrew Masoretic tradition. Tove's analysis of the scroll confirmed that 8 Hev Xi-Gr represents a revised Greek translation produced to bring earlier Greek versions into closer alignment with the Hebrew, which means the Zechariah 9:9 text was being carefully preserved and verified, not loosely transmitted. Matthew 21 and John 12 both cite Zechariah 9:9 explicitly when describing the entry into Jerusalem. Their citations are not interpretive reach. The specific detail they cite, the donkey, was in the text 5 centuries before the event they describe. Matthew's account notes that both the donkey and its colt were brought, in direct alignment with the compound description in Zechariah 9:9 verse. John 12:16 adds something the other accounts don't, that the disciples did not understand the connection to Zechariah's text at the time the event occurred. They recognized it only afterward, when they recalled that the text said exactly this. The recognition was retrospective. The text was already old. What makes Zechariah 9:9 particularly difficult to categorize as general messianic expectation is the animal. The prophecy does not select the prestigious option. It selects the humble one. Specifically, the author writing in 520 BC was not describing the triumphant arrival of a warrior king. He was predicting something the conditions of his era gave him no visible basis to predict, a figure arriving at Jerusalem's highest moment of public recognition on the most mundane available animal. That inversion is what Zechariah wrote. 5 centuries later, 2 gospel writers found it in the text they already possessed. The standard framework for explaining prophetic fulfillment accounts for the general expectation of a coming king entering Jerusalem in triumph. What it cannot account for is the donkey. A general expectation of royal arrival would not specify the animal. A symbolic prediction of humble kingship might use a donkey as a rhetorical image. But Zechariah 9:9 specifies the donkey, specifies it as a colt, and binds the specification to the character of the king as righteous and lowly in a single breath. John 12:16 records that the people who were present did not interpret it as a prophetic fulfillment while it was happening. The 8 Hevexayir scroll is in the Israel Antiquities Authority collection. The donkey is still in the text. Number 8. Zechariah 12:10. The textual history of Zechariah 12:10 presents a grammatical problem that has never been adequately resolved. The verse is in the canonical Hebrew Bible. It has been there since at least the 9th century C, when the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex, the foundational manuscripts of the Masoretic tradition, were compiled. The verse has not been removed or obscured. It has simply been left to stand. In the first person, unexplained, chapter 12 is structured as an oracle about Jerusalem's future. A siege of the city, a dramatic intervention, a great mourning. The chapter builds toward verse 10, where the speaker, identified throughout the surrounding verses as Ha, the divine name of the God of Israel, delivers a statement that strains against every available theological category. The verse reads, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. And they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child." The speaker pouring out the Spirit is Yeh. The next phrase, "they will look on me, the one they have pierced." The Hebrew verb for pierced is dakar, a word with no ambiguity in its semantic range. It appears in Judges 9:54, Numbers 25:8, and Jeremiah 37:10 in context describing physical violence causing death, a sword run through a body, a spear to the belly. Dakar is not metaphorical. It is not a scribal variant. It describes a physical wound from a weapon that kills the person it strikes. This is the word the text uses for what happens to Yahweh. The grammar is explicit. The first-person speaker, identified by context as Yahweh, is the one who has been pierced. The mourning in the verse is a response to looking on the pierced figure. The mourning is deep, as one mourns for an only child. Whatever event the text describes, the response to it is one of the most intense forms of grief the Hebrew Bible can name. Several later Greek translation traditions show evidence of pressure on this grammar. Some manuscripts render the verb in ways that shift the agency, or soften the first-person identification. But the Masoretic text and the reading reflected in the Septuagint both preserve the piercing and the mourning as the core of the verse. The New Testament cites Zechariah 12:10 twice, in John 19:37, immediately after the account of the spear wound inflicted on the crucified figure, and in Revelation 1:7, describing the one coming on clouds whom every eye will see, including those who pierced him. The New Testament authors were not generating new meaning for the verse. They were reading its existing grammar and reporting what they believed they had seen. What makes this passage genuinely unsettling is not the New Testament application. It is the theological impossibility within Zechariah's own world. A 6th or 5th century BC Israelite prophet writing within a rigorously monotheistic tradition had no available theological framework for a statement in which Yo speaks in the first person and describes having been physically pierced. The concept did not exist. The grammar did not fit. Strict Second Temple Jewish monotheism had no category for a divine being who is both the speaker pouring out grace and the figure who has been wounded. The truly unsettling aspect of Zechariah 12:10 is not that it aligns with the crucifixion account. It is that it aligned with nothing in Zechariah's own theological world. The statement does not fit the author's world. It fits a world that would not arrive for another 5 centuries. The Hebrew Dakar is still in verse 10 of chapter 12 of the canonical book of Zechariah. The Aleppo Codex preserves it. The Leningrad Codex preserves it. The grammar still reads, "The speaker is Yih. The pierced one is the speaker." The verse has never been corrected. The theological problem it poses has never been resolved. It sits in the text, in the first person, in ancient Hebrew, unchanged. Number 7. Isaiah 7:14 on an autumn afternoon in late 1947. A Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was searching for a stray animal in the limestone cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a narrow cave opening. He heard pottery breaking inside, the hollow, sharp crack of ancient clay shattering in an enclosed space. He came back the following morning with a companion, lowered himself through the opening, and found himself in a cave containing large clay jars. Inside the jars were scrolls wrapped in linen. He did not know what he had found. He pulled them out and left. One of those scrolls would be designated 1Q Isaiah, the Great Isaiah Scroll. It contained all 66 chapters of Isaiah. In its 11th column of parchment, in Hebrew that was approximately 2,100 years old, was the text of Isaiah 7:14. The verses generated one of the most sustained textual controversies in the history of biblical scholarship. What it says in every surviving tradition is that a sign will be given, a young woman will conceive and bear a son, and she will name him Emmanuel. The controversy centers on a single Hebrew word, the word used to describe the young woman. The Hebrew in the text is alma. It means a young woman of marriageable age. The evidence for this meaning is consistent across its 8 other appearances in the Hebrew Bible: Genesis 24:43, Exodus 2:8, Song of Songs 1:3, Song of Songs 6:8, Proverbs 30:19, and Psalm 68:25. In not one of these instances does alma carry the meaning of virgin. The Hebrew Bible has a specific word for virgin, Bethulah, used elsewhere in Isaiah and throughout the canon when virginity is the intended meaning. Isaiah 7:14 uses alma, not Bethulah. The standard critical argument constructed from this evidence appeared, for decades, straightforward. Matthew 1:23 quotes Isaiah 7:14 in the context of the virgin birth, but Matthew was quoting an error, either reading a virgin interpretation into a text that doesn't contain one, or deliberately misapplying a prophecy that referred to a child born in Ahaz's own political crisis. The argument collapsed at the Septuagint. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria, beginning in approximately the 3rd century BCE. At minimum 250 years before the birth of Jesus, renders the Hebrew alma in Isaiah 7:14 as the Greek parthenos. Parthenos means virgin, not young woman, not maiden. Virgin, the distinction in Greek is not subtle. The Septuagint translators had the Hebrew in front of them. They read the word alma. They chose to render it as virgin. The Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah, confirms that the Hebrew text at the time of copying, approximately 150-125 BCE, based on paleographic analysis and AMS radiocarbon dating, reads alma. The scroll predates the Common Era. It preserves the original Hebrew word. The word is alma, not Bethulah. The case appeared settled in the critical direction. The Hebrew says young woman. The Matthew citation is of the Greek translation, and the virgin reading is a translation choice, not an original meaning. Then the chronology reasserted itself. The Septuagint translation of Isaiah 7:14 as Parthenos dates to approximately 270-250 BCE. Matthew was written approximately 80-90 C. The virgin reading of Isaiah 7:14 is therefore older than the Gospel of Matthew by 3 centuries. It is a pre-Christian Jewish translation produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria for a Jewish audience in the pre-Christian period. The virgin reading of Isaiah 7:14 did not originate with Christian apologetics. It was already there, in a Jewish translation made 2.5 centuries before the event it was later applied to. What makes this entry genuinely difficult to process is the direction of the influence. The scholarly argument that Matthew read a virgin birth meaning into a prophecy that didn't contain one becomes significantly harder to maintain when the translation Matthew cites predates Matthew by 300 years and was produced by Jewish scholars with no interest in prefiguring a Christian nativity narrative. Whether the Alexandrian translators were working from a variant Hebrew tradition following an exegetical convention, or translating what they genuinely believed the text conveyed, the result is the same: The virgin reading of Isaiah 7:14 is documented in a pre-Christian Jewish manuscript tradition before a single verse of the New Testament existed. The Great Isaiah Scroll, all 7.34 meters of it, its 54 columns of Hebrew text containing both halves of the book, is on permanent display in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Column 11 contains Isaiah 7:14. The word Alma is in it, unchanged, in the same ink laid down 2,100 years ago. The pre-Christian Septuagint translated it as Parthenos. No later editor corrected the Septuagint. The translation was already old when the event it was applied to had not yet occurred. Number 6. Psalm 22 in March 1961. Yigael Yadin's team was working through the innermost chambers of a cave system in the Nahal Hever Canyon in the Judean desert, a site that came to be called the Cave of Letters. The cave had already yielded extraordinary material. Personal correspondence from the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132-135 C. Family documents from Jewish refugees who had fled into the desert and never returned. In a deeper section of the cave, the team found a bundle of Hebrew scroll fragments, fragmentary, carefully preserved in the same dry conditions that had kept the Bar Kokhba letters intact for 18 centuries. The fragments were from a Psalms scroll, designated 5 Flux 6 Hev Ps, the Nahal Hever Psalms scroll. They dated to the 1st or early 2nd century C. The team unrolled them carefully. Among the preserved psalms was a text from Psalm 22. And in the 16th verse, a verse that had been at the center of a textual dispute for centuries, they found a reading the Masoretic tradition did not preserve. Psalm 22 carries a superscription attributing it to David. Its traditional placement in the Israelite literary tradition puts its composition in the 11th or 10th century BC, well before the Assyrian and Babylonian periods. The psalm opens with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" the exact phrase, in the original Hebrew Eli lama azavtani. Reported in Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34 as the words spoken from the cross. The correspondences that follow in the psalm extend well beyond that opening line. The text describes the sufferer surrounded by mockery, bystanders wagging their heads, saying that since he trusted in God, God should rescue him. Matthew 27:43 records precisely this scene in precisely this form. The psalm describes bones pulled out of joint. It describes intense thirst, the mouth dried out, the tongue sticking to the jaw, a detail that aligns with the physiological account of crucifixion documented by forensic pathologist Frederick Zugibe, who published extensively on crucifixion physiology and confirmed that severe dehydration is among the primary causes of death in this form of execution. The psalm describes being enclosed by a crowd. At verse 18, it describes the division of the sufferer's garments and the casting of lots over his clothing. John 19:23-24 cites this specific detail explicitly, identifying it as the fulfillment of Psalm 22:18. These correspondences occur in a text whose traditional dating precedes the Roman introduction of crucifixion to Judea by approximately 9 centuries. The Roman administrative use of crucifixion as a judicial execution method in the Judean region dates to after Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem in 63 BCE. The physical description in Psalm 22, the thirst, the encirclement. The garment division, the bones out of joint, matches the documented medical sequelae of crucifixion death in ways that no other ancient execution method produces. The critical dispute centers on verse 16. The Masoretic text, the received Hebrew tradition, reads Ka'ari, like a lion, my hands and my feet. The image of a lion attacking the extremities is grammatically awkward and contextually strained. The sentence has no predicate in the Hebrew. Commentators have been debating the syntax since at least the medieval period. The Septuagint, produced in the 3rd century BC, renders the same verse as they dug my hands and my feet, a reading that implies piercing or excavating. Describing a wound to the extremities, the Latin Vulgate renders it fodderant, they dug, they pierced. The 5-6 P's scroll from Nahal Hever reads Ka'aru, derived from a root meaning to dig or bore through. Not Ka'ari, like a hino. Ka'aru. The difference between the two readings is a single Hebrew letter. One letter separates a lion attacking the extremities from wounds to the hands and feet. But here's where the manuscript evidence becomes more than a textual curiosity. The Septuagint, produced in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, preserves the piercing reading. The Nahal Hever scroll, produced in the 1st or early 2nd century C, preserves the piercing reading. The two independent pre-Christian or near-contemporary manuscript traditions both carry a text that describes wounds to the hands and feet. The Masoretic tradition, finalized by the Masoretic scribes of the 6th through 9th centuries C, carries a lion. Someone changed a letter. When the change was made, and who made it, and what they were looking at when they made it. These questions have not been settled. A pre-Christian manuscript tradition preserves a reading of Psalm 22:16 that describes wounds to the hands and feet, in a psalm whose opening words were spoken from a cross, whose description of mockery was recorded by 2 evangelists, whose account of the garment lottery was cited explicitly by a 3rd. In a text composed approximately 9 centuries before the execution method that most precisely matches its description arrived in the region. The Nahal Hever Psalms scroll is held in the Israel Antiquities Authority collection. In it, verse 16 describes something done to the hands and feet. The psalm was already centuries old when the method that fits the description was introduced. The Masoretic tradition reads Ka'ari. The Nahal Hever tradition reads Ka'aru. 1 letter between them, and 9 centuries between the psalm and the nails. If you've been watching this far, before we get to number 5, hit subscribe if you haven't already. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is there. Every single one gets read. Number 5. Daniel 7:13-14 in 1952. Archaeologists excavating Cave 4 at Qumran, the most densely packed of all the Qumran cave sites, eventually yielding fragments from approximately 900 separate manuscripts. Recovered a series of fragmentary texts from the Book of Daniel. The collection was designated 4Q Dana through 4Q Dan. Eugene Ulrich of the University of Notre Dame and Peter Flint of Trinity Western University published the critical additions and discoveries in the Judean Desert XX in 2010. Paleographic analysis placed the 4Q Dana fragments at approximately 125-100 BCE, which means the text of Daniel was being copied as authoritative scripture within a generation of its composition, according to the mainstream scholarly dating of the book. What those fragments preserved in Aramaic, the language of the eastern portion of the book of Daniel, was chapter 7. This was the passage Jesus of Nazareth cited more frequently than any other text in the Hebrew Bible. And what it described was a figure who did not yet exist in the world Zechariah, Micah, or Isaiah had written into, or who had not yet arrived. The mainstream scholarly consensus dates the final form of Daniel to approximately 165-164 BCE, during the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Conservative scholarship maintains a 6th century BC date. In either case, the Cave 4 fragments establish that the text of Daniel 7 was fixed and circulating as authoritative scripture no later than approximately 100 BC, at minimum 60 to 100 years before Jesus was born. In chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, Daniel describes a night vision. He sees one described as Baranash, the Aramaic phrase meaning like a son of man, like a human being. This figure approaches the Ancient of Days, the divine figure on the throne, and is brought before him. What happens next is extraordinary within the context of Second Temple Jewish theology. The Ancient of Days gives this figure authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language are described as worshiping him. The Aramaic verb avad, the verb used for divine service. His dominion is described as everlasting, an empire that will not pass away, and a kingdom that will never be destroyed. This is not a human king receiving a human kingdom. The worship described is the worship given to the divine. The permanence described exceeds any human political arrangement. The Bar and Ash figure in Daniel 7 occupies a category that Second Temple Jewish theology had no stable name for, a figure with divine authority who nonetheless appears like a human being. In the Gospels, the phrase Son of Man, rendering the Aramaic Bar and Ash, appears in the first-person speech of Jesus approximately 80 times across Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is the phrase Jesus uses almost exclusively when referring to himself in the third person. The systematicity of the usage is not incidental. John Collins of Yale Divinity School, whose commentary on Daniel published by Eerdmans in 1993 remains the standard scholarly reference on the book's imagery, argued extensively that the Daniel 7 figure represents a pre-Christian category of divine human agent receiving cosmic authority, and that this category was already present in the Jewish literary tradition, being developed and interpreted before any Christian theology existed to apply it. The Similitudes of Enoch, a non-canonical Jewish text preserved in Ethiopic Ge'ez, likely composed in the 1st century BC or early 1st century C, describes a figure called the Son of Man, using language closely parallel to Daniel 7, pre-existent. Concealed before the throne of the Ancient of Days, destined to judge the kings of the earth and reign eternally. Whatever the exact dating of the similitudes, their existence confirms that the Daniel 7 Son of Man figure was being actively developed as an interpretive category in the pre-Christian or earliest Christian Jewish environment. The category was not invented by the church. It was already in circulation. Consider the implication. When Jesus used Son of Man as his primary self-designation, the title carried a defined referent. The audience that heard it was hearing a specific claim, a reference to Daniel 7:13-14, to a figure already described as receiving eternal authority and the worship of all nations. Jesus was not asking his listeners to construct a new interpretive category. He was identifying himself with a figure whose description was already old, already preserved in Aramaic on parchment in a cave in the Judean desert, already being copied and transmitted as authoritative scripture. The identification was either the most audacious claim in the ancient world or the most precisely constructed one. The Bar and Ash figure of Daniel 7 does not merely receive a kingdom. He receives the worship that belongs to the divine, in a form that does not decay. The scholars who have analyzed the Danielic Son of Man most closely: Collins at Yale, Gabriella Boccaccini at the University of Michigan, Lauren Stuckenbrook at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, continue to debate exactly what the Daniel 7 figure was understood to be within the Second Temple Jewish interpretive tradition. What those publications do not contain is an explanation for why Jesus chose this specific title, used it with this specific systematic frequency, and deployed it in contexts that map directly onto a pre-existing description of a figure who receives eternal dominion and the worship of all peoples. The title was already there, already defined. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove the definition was already old. Number 4. The Messianic Banquet Cave 1 at Qumran yielded, in the winter of 1946-47, a collection of scrolls that would eventually be recognized as the most significant manuscript discovery of the 20th century. Among the material recovered and brought to the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem, where Millar Burrows of Yale Divinity School was serving as annual professor, was a scroll that proved to be composite, the larger community rule text known as 1QS, with a shorter text rolled inside it. That shorter text would be designated 1QSA, the rule of the congregation. Dominique Barthélemy and Jeff Millick published the critical edition and discoveries in the Judean Desert Thirst in 1955. When the full content of 1QSA was understood, specifically what its second column described in detail, it left a question that Millar Burrows never fully answered in his published work. What, exactly, had the Qumran community been practicing? And how long had they been doing it? The rule of the congregation describes the regulations of the Qumran community for what it calls the last days. Its second column, verses 11 through 22, describes a formal meal, not a routine communal dinner, a messianic banquet, a meal explicitly convened in the anticipated presence of the messianic figures the community expected. The text describes the gathering of the full community, the council, the men of renown, the priestly leadership. The priestly Messiah is present. The Messiah of Israel is present. When the company is assembled at the table, the procedure is specified. The priest shall extend his hand first and bless the bread and the wine. Then, and only then, shall the Messiah of Israel extend his hand to the bread. The sequence is structural, priestly blessing of bread and wine, followed by the messianic figure receiving the elements. The scroll dates to approximately 175 BCE. The Qumran community's founding is placed by the scholarly consensus in the late 2nd century BCE. The messianic banquet described in 1 QSA was not a practice this community invented and immediately wrote down. It was a practice they codified, which means the practice and the theological framework it expressed preceded the scroll's composition. The meal was at least 3 generations old before Jesus was born. Jonathan Klons of Boston University published a detailed examination of the structural parallels between the Qumran Messianic Banquet and the Last Supper accounts in the Journal of Jewish Studies in 2001. His analysis identified the following correspondences: a formal meal, bread and wine as the primary elements, a blessing of those elements by a priestly figure, the Messiah present at the table, an explicitly eschatological context describing the meal as belonging to the end of days period. Every structural feature of the Last Supper, as described in the Synoptic Gospels, has a parallel in 1 QSA 2:11-22. Clones was careful in his conclusions. The structural parallels are real. The Qumran practice demonstrably predates the New Testament accounts, and whether Jesus and his disciples were specifically aware of the Qumran tradition is a question the evidence cannot answer. But what the evidence can answer is this: a formal messianic meal of bread and wine, blessed by a priestly figure, in an end times context. With the Messiah present and receiving the elements after the blessing, was already an established practice in a pre-Christian Jewish community at least a century before the Last Supper. But here's where the archaeological record complicates both the devotional and the dismissive readings simultaneously. The 1 QSA evidence does not diminish the Last Supper account. It contextualizes it. If Jesus was operating within the same broad Second Temple Jewish environment that produced the Qumran community, and the scholarly consensus places him squarely in that environment, then the formal messianic meal of bread and wine was not a new ritual he created in an upper room. It was a ritual his world already knew. He may have been enacting a tradition that already had a century of practice behind it, and giving it a new specific significance by identifying himself as the Messiah present at the table. The alternative is that the structural correspondence between 1 QSA and the Last Supper, bread, wine, priestly blessing, messianic figure, eschatological context, is coincidental. That correspondence is precise enough to account for every structural element, not just the general shape. The 1 QSA scroll is in the holdings of the Israel Antiquities Authority. Its second column specifies a formal meal, bread, wine, the priestly blessing, the Messiah extending his hand to the bread after the blessing. The most practiced ritual in global Christianity, performed in some form in every tradition from the Catholic Mass to Protestant Communion, observed by billions of people each week, follows the same sequence. The Qumran community wrote it down at least a century before anyone gave it the name it now carries. Number 3. 11 Melchi's Edek Cave 11 at Qumran was not discovered by archaeologists. In approximately 1956, Tamire Bedouin tribesmen extracted a collection of scrolls from the cave and sold them through the Bethlehem Antiquities Market, the same channel through which most of the early Dead Sea Scrolls material had moved since 1947. Among the fragments that reached scholarly hands through that route was a document containing 11 damaged parchment pieces. They were small. The text was dense. In 1965, Adam Simon van der Wood, a Dutch biblical scholar at the University of Groningen, one of the early generation of scholars who had devoted their careers to the emerging Dead Sea Scrolls literature, published the text in Oud Testamentische Studien, the journal of the Dutch Old Testament Society. His paper was titled Melchizedek als himmlische Erlzergestalt in den neugefundenen eschatologischen Midrashim aus Qumran Hlaishi, Melchizedek as a heavenly redeemer figure in newly found eschatological texts from Qumran Cave 11. Van der Woude described the text carefully and systematically. He noted what it said about Melchizedek. He was a rigorous scholar who did not overstate. But what his paper's title chose to call attention to, a heavenly redeemer figure, was not a routine designation in the Second Temple Jewish corpus, and as he described the document's content. A comparison that had no scholarly precedent before 1965 became unavoidable. The scroll fragment is now designated 11Q13. It is dated paleographically to approximately 175 BCE. It is not a Pesher commentary or a legal code. It is an eschatological text, a description of end-time events structured around the figure of Melchizedek. The Melchizedek of the canonical Hebrew Bible appears in exactly two places. In Genesis 14:18-20, he is king of Salem and priest of God Most High, bringing bread and wine and blessing Abraham. In Psalm 110:4, the Davidic king is addressed as a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Two brief appearances, no developed theology, no narrative, no description of Melchizedek's ultimate significance. The canonical text does not elaborate. 11Q13 elaborates. What it describes is a Melchizedek who is a heavenly figure, described in the text using the Hebrew Elohim, the designation for divine beings. He presides over the divine assembly. The text applies Isaiah 61:1 to him directly. The anointed one proclaiming liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners is Melchizedek. He will atone for the sins of the sons of light in the final Jubilee, the 10th Jubilee, the eschatological end period. He will judge the assembly of Belial. He functions as a divine intercessor between his community and God. This is not a minor ritual functionary. The Melchizedek of 11Q13 is a heavenly high priest, divine in status, eternal in function, atoning for sin, proclaiming freedom, exercising judgment over evil on behalf of a covenant community at the end of history. Now read the letter to the Hebrews. Chapters 5 through 7 of Hebrews form the central theological argument of the letter. The argument is that Jesus holds a priesthood superior to the Levitical priesthood. Superior because Jesus is a priest not in the Levitical line, but in the order of Melchizedek, as Psalm 110:4 specified. Hebrews 5:10 identifies Jesus as high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews 7001:28 develops the argument, Melchizedek's priesthood is eternal. Without genealogical record of beginning or end, therefore superior to the Levitical line that depends on descent and mortality. The argument assumes the audience already understands that Melchizedek's priesthood is of a different, superior category. It assumes they know Melchizedek is an eternal heavenly figure. 2 verses in Genesis and 1 verse in Psalms cannot support that weight. The mainstream scholarly reading of Hebrews 5:7 before 1965 was that the Melchizedek typology was an innovative theological construction, a creative Christian appropriation of a marginal biblical figure into a novel priestly framework built to explain Jesus' unique status. Hebrews was assumed to be building the architecture from scratch. Then, 11Q13 was published. Paul Kobelski of Marquette University published the definitive comparative analysis in his 1981 monograph, Melchizedek and Melchioresa, through the Catholic Biblical Association of America. His conclusion was stated without equivocation. The author of Hebrews was drawing on a pre-existing Melchizedek tradition that described Melchizedek as a heavenly atoning figure, not inventing that tradition. The framework of Hebrews 5:7 was already present in a pre-Christian Jewish text in the Judean desert, composed at minimum 150 years before the letter that applied it. What makes the 11Q Melchizedek evidence genuinely difficult to dismiss is the direction of the theological specificity. The letter to the Hebrews does not construct a heavenly atoning Melchizedek out of general typological reasoning. It argues for a specific theological category that matches, in detail, the category already described in 11Q13, a heavenly, eternal, atoning priestly figure above the Levitical line, acting on behalf of a covenant community at the end of the age. Hebrews is not the origin point of this theology. It is the New Testament's application of a theology that was already old. The author of the letter to the Hebrews, writing approximately 1690 CE, built an argument about Melchizedek as the template for understanding Jesus' priesthood that worked, because the audience already recognized the category. 2 verses in Genesis alone cannot produce that recognition. The category required the interpretive tradition that 11Q13 represents. The scroll was written at least 150 years before the letter. The theology the scroll preserves is older still. No framework the author of Hebrews could have possessed accounts for the parallel except the one that is directly visible. The Melchizedek theology the letter applies was already there, in the pre-Christian Jewish literary tradition, codified on parchment in a cave in the Judean desert, waiting to be applied. Number 2, 4Q246. Son of God in the spring of 1952. Archaeologists excavating Cave 4 at Qumran recovered fragments of approximately 900 separate manuscript texts. Among that enormous cache was a small Aramaic fragment, 8 lines across 2 columns. It was cataloged, photographed, and set aside. It would remain unpublished for 40 years. In 1972, Jeff Milik, the Polish priest and scholar who had been assigned primary editorial responsibility for the Cave 4 Aramaic texts, mentioned the fragment at a Society of Biblical Literature conference in Los Angeles. He read a portion of its text to the assembled scholars and offered a preliminary interpretation. He did not publish it. The fragment remained in the editorial queue. In the late 1980s, growing pressure over the pace of the Cave 4 publication project, what critics called the Dead Sea Scrolls monopoly, led to sustained public and scholarly complaints about restricted access. In 1991, Robert Eisenman and James Robinson published an unauthorized photographic concordance of unpublished fragments, forcing the Israeli Antiquities Authority to open the photographic archive to all scholars. That same year, Mile Puch of the École Biblique et Archéologique Française in Jerusalem, one of the leading specialists in Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls texts, produced the first full critical study of the fragment that had been sitting in the archive for 40 years. The fragment was designated 4Q246. What it said required 33 pages to address. The surviving text in column 2 preserves 2 consecutive lines. In Puch's reconstruction, they read, "He will be called Son of God, and they will call him Son of the Most High." The Aramaic transliteration from the fragment, Bar di el Yitkre, Dobrur Elion Yekrune, Son of God he will be called. Son of the Most High they will call him. Open Luke 132 and 135. In the Annunciation narrative, the angel Gabriel speaking to Mary, verse 32 says, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High." Verse 35 continues, "The Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." The Greek of Luke, Hios Hiisto Klethesetai, Klethesetai Hios Theo. The phrases Son of God and Son of the Most High, in that configuration, in an Aramaic messianic context, applied to an expected figure whose reign will be described as peaceful and eternal, are present in 4Q246. They are present in Luke 132:35. The 4Q246 fragment dates to approximately 150 BCE based on paleographic analysis. The Gospel of Luke was written approximately 80-90 C. The Aramaic formulation is at minimum 150 years older than the Greek Gospel that contains the same words. The scholarly debate on 4Q246 has not been about whether the linguistic parallel is real. The parallel is visually undeniable when the 2 texts are placed side by side. The debate has been about the identity of the figure in 4Q246, whether the Son of God is a positive messianic figure as John Collins of Yale Divinity School argued in The Scepter and the Star, published by Doubleday in 1995, or a pagan tyrant making arrogant divine claims, as other scholars proposed. Collins assembled the contextual case for the positive messianic reading. The figure's reign is described as peaceful. The nations serve him. The Son of God designation in Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls texts is used consistently for positive figures. The debate continues in academic publications. No consensus has settled it. But the debate's terms are revealing. Even scholars who argue the 4Q246 figure is negative, a human usurper claiming divine titles, acknowledge that the language Son of God and Son of the Most High in a Semitic messianic or proto-messianic context was not invented by early Christian theology. The formulation was available. It existed in the pre-Christian Jewish literary environment. Whatever the Qumran text meant to apply it to, the language itself was already there, already being used in a Jewish context to describe a specific figure, 150 years before Luke placed it in Gabriel's mouth. The truly unsettling aspect of 4Q246 is not that the parallel exists, it is what it does to the standard two-option framework for explaining the Annunciation language. Option 1. Luke invented the divine sonship titles for Jesus, and they represent original Christian theological construction. Option 2. Luke was drawing on a pre-existing Jewish formulation of divine messianic identity that was already circulating in the Semitic tradition. The 40-year gap between the discovery of the fragment and its publication means that for 4 decades, a text containing the exact language of Luke's Annunciation sat in an archive in East Jerusalem, photographed and cataloged, while the question of where Luke's language came from was discussed in complete ignorance of its most direct antecedent. The 4Q246 fragment is held in the collection of the Israel Antiquities Authority. It is a small piece of Aramaic parchment. 2 of its lines read, "He will be called Son of God, and they will call him Son of the Most High." Luke 1:32 reads, "He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Most High." Luke 1:35 reads, "He will be called the Son of God." The Aramaic fragment is at least 150 years older than the Greek Gospel that contains the same words. Both still exist. Both still say exactly what they say. Number 1. Isaiah 53 on the evening of November 29, 1947. A professor of archaeology at Hebrew University named Eleazar Lipa Sukenik received a message through an intermediary. A Jewish antiquities dealer in Bethlehem had scrolls, ancient Hebrew scrolls, pulled from a cave near the Dead Sea. November 29, 1947 was the day the United Nations General Assembly was voting on Resolution 181, the partition plan that would create the State of Israel. Jerusalem was on the edge of sectarian violence. The city was divided into sectors. Sukenik rode an Arab bus through the Arab-controlled quarter to reach the Bethlehem dealer's location. He was the only Jew on the bus. He looked at the photographs. He recognized what he was seeing. He purchased 3 of the scrolls and rode back through the same streets carrying them. Later, after he had the full collection in hand and had been working through the texts, his son Yigael Yadin, who would become one of Israel's most celebrated archaeologists, described his father sitting at his desk late at night reading the scrolls and weeping. Not from sorrow, from something he found difficult to name. The texts were at least 2,000 years old. The Hebrew was clear, and in one of the scrolls, in what would be designated 1Q Isa'ah, the Great Isaiah Scroll, the 44th column of parchment contained the full text of Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12. The Great Isaiah Scroll was produced approximately 150-125 BC, according to paleographic analysis, confirmed by M's radiocarbon dating to the late 2nd or early 1st century BC. It contains all 66 chapters of Isaiah. It is the oldest substantially complete copy of any biblical book ever recovered. The scroll predates the next oldest full Hebrew manuscript of Isaiah by approximately 1,000 years. And across those 1,000 years of manuscript copying, the text of Isaiah 53 is essentially identical. What chapter 53 contains is a narrative, not a theological reflection, not a lamentation over Israel's collective suffering. a specific sequential narrative describing events in an identifiable order, with identifiable participants. The narrative opens with a figure who is despised, rejected, acquainted with grief. The text then makes its first precise claim. The figure was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our... The Hebrew verb for pierced, mekalal, from the root kalel, describes physical wounding with an instrument. The word is not used metaphorically elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible in similar constructions. The wound is real in the text's own language. The text then describes the figure as being led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep is silent before its shearers. So he did not open his mouth. Matthew 27:14 records that before Pilate's questioning, Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge. Mark 15:5 uses nearly identical language. The evangelists were describing silence before an official proceeding. Isaiah 53:7 described silence before oppressors 7 centuries earlier, in identical terms. Isaiah 53:8 states that by oppression and judgment he was taken away, a description of arrest and legal proceedings leading to death. Verse 9 specifies the burial conditions. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. The first element, grave with the wicked, aligns with the gospel accounts of the crucifixion between 2 criminals. The second element, with the rich in his death, aligns with Matthew 27:57-60, which identifies the man who provided the tomb as Joseph of Arimathea, described specifically as a wealthy man. Both burial elements are named separately. Both appear in the text. Both appear in the accounts. Verse 11, in the reading preserved by 1Q Isaa and confirmed by a second Cave 4 fragment designated 4Q Isa D, contains the phrase or, light, the text reads, after the suffering of his soul, he will see light and be satisfied. The Masoretic text, finalized centuries after the Dead Sea Scrolls tradition, omits the word or. The Great Isaiah Scroll says the servant sees light after the suffering of his soul ends. The Septuagint also preserves the light. 2 pre-Christian manuscript traditions, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek translation produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria, both read that the figure sees light after his suffering is complete. This is not life extended, not survival. The servant has already been described as cut off from the land of the living. The light he sees comes after that cutting off. Eleazar Sukenik was not reading a passage about national collective suffering. He was reading a sequential account of a specific figure's death and what came after it. Verse 12 closes the narrative. He poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors, and made intercession for the transgressors. In Luke 23:34, the intercession is spoken explicitly, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Raymond Brown, whose 2-volume The Death of the Messiah, published by Doubleday in 1994 and 1998, remains the standard scholarly reference on the gospel passion narratives. Analyzed the Isaiah 53 correspondences in detail. Brown was a Catholic priest and a rigorous historical scholar simultaneously. His analysis did not resolve the question of whether the correspondences reflect authorial design, fulfillment of prophecy, or historical accident. He noted only that the correspondences are real, are numerous, and are specific enough to have occupied serious scholarly attention for 2 centuries without producing a settled account. For the alignment between Isaiah 53 and the gospel passion narrative to be coincidental, the coincidence must extend not just to the wound, but to the silence before the official proceeding, not just to the death, but to the specific dual burial conditions. With criminals and with a wealthy individual, not just to the death, but to the seeing of light afterward, not just to the execution, but to the intercession for those who caused it. Each of these elements appears in a New Testament passion account. Each of them also appears, in sequence, in a document the Dead Sea Scrolls establish was affixed. Transmitted manuscript at minimum 150 years before the events it appears to describe. The standard critical explanation that the gospel authors constructed their passion narrative by reading Isaiah 53 backward and designing the accounts to match the prophecy has been argued carefully and deserves to be stated fairly. Its counter-argument is equally careful, the specific burial details are not details that arise naturally from literary design working forward from a text. The combination of criminal burial alongside wealthy burial, two separate, specific, apparently contradictory burial conditions for the same figure, is not a detail a narrative designer would likely invent to match a prophecy. It is the kind of incidental specificity that survives in testimony. N.T. Wright at Oxford, and later at St. Andrews, John Meyer at Notre Dame and a marginal Jew, Brown at Union Theological Seminary, scholars of multiple traditions working at the highest level of historical critical method have produced no consensus. The alignment exists. The text predates the events. The question of why a fixed manuscript from the Judean desert describes those events in sequence, in an identifiable order with incidental burial specificity that matches, has not been closed. The Great Isaiah Scroll is in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, enclosed in a climate-controlled case beneath a white dome shaped to recall the lids of the clay jars in which it was preserved for 2 millennia. Column 44 contains Isaiah 53. The Hebrew is the same Hebrew Sekenic read in 1947, the same Hebrew the anonymous scribe copied in approximately 125 BCE, the same Hebrew of a composition that precedes both of them by somewhere between 2 and 7 centuries, depending on which scholar you read. The servant in that column was pierced. He was silent. He was buried with the wicked and with the rich. He saw light. He made intercession for those who had him killed. The mainstream critical framework accounts for many aspects of the correspondence between Isaiah 53 and the Gospel Passion narrative. What 2 centuries of scholarship have not accounted for is why the specific combination, this particular sequence of wound, trial, silence, dual burial, light, and intercession, was already old when Eleazar Sukenik wept over it on the night the state that would house it voted itself into existence. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.